This footage showcases an event from the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. In the video, a suicide FPV drone targets a Leopard 2 tank belonging to the Ukrainian armed forces. Numerous similar videos circulate on the internet, often accompanied by comments asserting the shortcomings of Western tanks and the superiority of Soviet military equipment over Western European counterparts. However, can we unequivocally draw such conclusions? Let's delve deeper into the matter. Despite claims of modernization according to NATO standards, the Ukrainian army remains deeply rooted in its origins, which trace back to the armed forces of the Soviet Union. This influence is most evident in the doctrines employed by Ukraine, closely mirroring various Soviet doctrines throughout history. Additionally, the weaponry organizational methods, and notably the human resources, reflect this connection. In simpler terms, the entire strategic framework of the Ukrainian military has been built upon Soviet principles, and this approach has been gradually implemented since 2014. This implementation involves reviving the Soviet mobilization system, incorporating cadre units, and making active use of the mobilization resource. The same principle applies to the material aspects, including equipment and armaments. The creation of such components involves a lengthy theoretical process, which culminates in the formation of doctrines. From these doctrines emerge concepts, and within these concepts, specific technical and tactical requirements are defined. Only after this extensive chain of intellectual activities is completed does the physical machinery come into existence. Naturally, every military institution, even each individual army, possesses its distinct perspective on combat operations and corresponding requisites. When techniques originating from a different military ideology are introduced into an army with minimal personnel training, incompatibility with the existing military doctrine can lead to these kinds of situations. Therefore, what sets apart the approaches to tank construction in the Soviet and Western contexts? The primary contrast between Soviet and Western heavy armored vehicle designs must be sought in the purposes they were intended for. To understand this, it's essential to delve into history. Specifically, let's explore the Cold War era. In discussions of technology, many authors tend to delve into the technical intricacies and attributes of machines. However, what holds greater significance than the individual concepts and doctrines is the very system that underpinned the creation and purpose of these weapons. The idea of a Soviet invasion of Europe was long viewed as an unavoidable prospect over many decades. Currently, the narrative surrounding the Cold War is predominantly presented by individuals lacking expertise and, to be candid, exhibiting somewhat unintelligent perspectives. Their arguments often simplistically reduce to a line of reasoning, akin to something like, "The Soviets had a foolish plan to overwhelm NATO with sheer force, which wouldn't have been successful." The actual situation, naturally, was considerably more intricate and convoluted. The Soviet military apparatus, emblematic of an industrial-era army taken to an extreme level of refinement, was perceived as an exceedingly perilous menace with the ability to wage conflict spanning from the Faroe-Icelandic border to the Mediterranean Sea. During the 1960s, the United States reached the realization that engaging in a military technical rivalry with the USSR centered on direct armed conflict was fruitless. Trying to defeat a nation functioning as a factory of war without becoming an even larger war factory proved unfeasible. In essence, pursuing asymmetrical confrontation held no promise. It took more than that to stop the USRC. And that advantage was found in the very model of Soviet strategic planning. The duration of a strategic operation is determined by the time required for ground troops to capture territory vital to the enemy. In the Western theater of operations, the strategic depth in case of the start of hostilities will be from 1,200 to 1,800 kilometers, and the average rate of advance of troops up to 50 kilometers per day. The estimated duration of combat operations will be from 25 to 35 days. Army General Ivan Igorovich Shavrov, Chief of the Military Academy of the General Staff. The vulnerability of the Soviet strategies for the European invasion rested primarily in the limited time frame allocated for executing the campaign. The Soviet Union had a mere 3-4 weeks to achieve an utter victory over the Alliance forces situated across the continent. Beyond this time frame, the initial shipments of U.S. Army tank divisions would commence their arrival in Europe. Any subsequent delay posed the risk of the conflict shifting into a static impasse with an unpredictable conclusion, or the extensive deployment of nuclear weapons. The Soviet leadership, encompassing both the military and political spheres, had valid concerns about such scenarios. This presented a significant strategic aspect, and the challenge was to tactfully leverage it. The objective was to restructure and outfit NATO forces in a manner that would impede the initial progression of the Soviet invasion, prolonging its duration and surpassing the established time constraints. Following this phase, diplomacy would come into play. However, the question remained: how to decelerate fleets consisting of tens of thousands of tanks, solely in the first wave of the invasion. This could only be achieved by possessing a comparable quantity of equipment, or by transitioning to an entirely distinct echelon of armament quality, and, consequently, personnel training. The significant scientific and technological leap in the 1970s played a pivotal role in the development of an advanced breed of military apparatus, empowered by the integration of digital microelectronics. This technological evolution spurred a corresponding transformation within the U.S. Armed Forces. This transformation encompassed enlisting volunteers who underwent extended training and service, granting them the capacity to proficiently handle cutting-edge weaponry and swiftly grasp its tactical nuances on the battlefield over a span of just a few years. Hence, as the Cold War concluded, a balance in ground forces between the Warsaw Pact and NATO was established. This equilibrium was reached as the Western Alliance effectively countered the Soviets' numerical advantage in tanks by employing a smaller yet more advanced fleet of vehicles. According to the 1987 records from NATO archives, the contrast in the quantity of armored tank vehicles exceeded a twofold difference. Now we should look at the differences between the Western and Soviet schools of tank building. Tanks of the Western Bloc. How does a typical version of such a tank manifest? It usually exhibits substantial weight, expansive geometric proportions, a 4-member crew, manual loading mechanism, and some of the ammunition positioned within the rear turret. It's important to recognize that this description isn't a definitive archetype. There are potential deviations from this norm. The selection of this concept was influenced by the perspectives of Western tank manufacturers regarding crew protection and the Western world's role. During the Cold War, as essentially the defensive side, tanks like Abrams, Leopards II, and Challengers primarily operated from concealed positions, often presenting only the frontal turret armor. Designers aimed to increase the tank's durability and the crew's survivability by isolating them from fuel and ammunition and incorporating a substantial armor volume. Among the crew members, the loader had the responsibility of maintaining firing capability even if any system malfunctioned. The presence of blast panels in the ammunition storage compartment aimed to release gas pressure upon impact. Furthermore, this design allowed for longer shell length compared to Russian tanks equipped with automatic loaders. However, limitations must always be considered. Nevertheless, every advantage comes with a cost. An expansive armor volume equates to higher weight and larger dimensions. Incorporating passive armor in certain systems results in increased stress on the tank's chassis, leading to diminished mobility and off-road capability. Looking at renowned Western tanks like the Abrams and Leopard. 2. The irregularity in side armor becomes apparent. While the turret side projections offer relatively commendable armor, with filler adjustments evident in recent versions, the hull sides have remained virtually unchanged for approximately 35 years, exhibiting a thickness of 30-60 millimeters, which can be likened to cardboard, so to speak. The tower roof presents a comparable situation. It's important to note that the thinly armored hull doesn't handle increased strains resulting from the recoil of more substantial caliber cannons particularly well. For instance, during tests involving the Leopard 2 equipped with a 140mm gun, the hull displayed signs of distortion. This situation necessitates either reinforcing the hull, thus exacerbating its already substantial weight, or innovating a substantially new tank design. Now, let's turn to the Soviet concept. Their tank design concept demonstrates characteristics such as a relatively compact size and weight, a compact layout, automatic loading, a crew of 3, and the arrangement of both ammunition and a portion of fuel in close proximity to the crew. This layout was derived from the lessons of World War I and the specific conditions of the European theater, where Soviet tanks were poised to engage. Particularly, wartime experiences revealed that 70 of incoming hits targeted the turret and upper hull areas. The decision to position the ammunition at the lower section of the hull proved both justified and rational. Additionally, within the European theater of operations, this placement would be granted supplementary safeguarding by a terrain barrier with an average height of 1.1 meters. The integration of an automatic or automated loading mechanism brought several advantages. It facilitated crew reduction, ensured a consistently high rate of fire, maintained firepower under conditions of radioactive contamination, and contributed to a more compact tank design due to the absence of a dedicated loader compartment. Russian tanks boast turrets with secure maneuvering angles of 30-35 degrees, while their turret sides are approximately 2.5 times smaller compared to those of Western tanks, rendering them harder to hit. One merit of the Soviet approach is the substantial thickness of the hull and turret side armor, measuring around 70-80 millimeters. This provides enhanced and more even protection against shell fragments and small caliber weaponry compared to their Western counterparts. Additionally, the turret roof possesses greater thickness and is fortified with dynamic protection blocks. Naturally, there are drawbacks associated with this strategy. The compact layout heightens the chances of projectiles or fuel being targeted, particularly in confined conflicts, where hits are equally probable from any direction. Of course, there exist drawbacks within this approach. The design of the automatic loader imposes limitations on the permissible shell length, with capacities of only 22 shells for the T-70, 90 and 24 for the TTE. Moreover, in the T-80, the vertical arrangement of shells increases the vulnerable area. An automatic loader, as malfunction, could divert the commander and gunner from their core duties, thereby reducing operational efficiency. Yet, the likelihood of such a failure is more likely in scenarios where the tank and crew are, to put it mildly, somewhat deficient in firepower. Fuel tanks, on one hand, introduce an additional hazard, but conversely, they offer supplementary protection against shrapnel and neutron effects when nuclear weaponry comes into play. It's important to remember that Soviet tanks were conceived during an era where the specter of nuclear conflict was a tangible consideration. Lastly, let's address a long-standing misconception about Russian tanks. The notion asserts that any shell hit, and sometimes, in more neglectful interpretations, any hit at all, triggers their detonation, inevitably resulting in an instantaneous turret ejection. However, this assertion isn't universally accurate. While instances of such occurrences exist, some captured on video, not every hit results in substantial damage, let alone ammunition detonation. There are documented instances where Soviet and Russian tanks absorbed 5-10, and sometimes even more, hits from handheld anti-tank weaponry without impairing their ability to fulfill combat objectives. However, in cases where a hit does affect the armament, it often triggers ignition of the powder charges, leading to a substantial column of fire emerging from the turret. Unfortunately, this almost certainly results in the crew's demise. Subsequently, the turret might be dislodged, triggered by the fire-induced detonation of high-explosive fragmentation projectiles, AFP, in the warhead. It's worth noting that, incidentally, around 85 of T-series tanks with blown-out turrets underwent detonation after the crew had vacated the vehicle.